I am such a product of my environment. We all are, actually. We are not some independent individual separate from our environment like Cartesian dualism seems to have conditioned us into thinking. First introduced by French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, the nerd that said, "I think, therefore I am," or "cogito ergo sum," or "je pense donc je suis." Cartesian dualism posits that your mind is completely separate from your body. According to Cartesian dualism, the body is physical, while the mind is some incorporeal form that is separated from the physical body. I think we, as a society, are taught inadvertently, or maybe completely on purpose, to believe that mental processes are separate from your physical body, and that Cartesian dualism is the only way to understand or approach problems. Because of that, we are also conditioned to extrapolate beyond that and believe that we are separate from our environment and our circumstances, and that if you took an individual and put them into a completely different environment, they'd remain the same individual, and the environment would remain the same environment. The way we view the mind-body problem seems to shape the way we view reality itself. The normalization of Cartesian dualism leads people to thinking things like, a genius is a genius because of their genius brain, not because of their access to intellectually stimulating materials that align with their interests. An artist is an artist because of their innate talent, and you are either talented or not. Mental illness is entirely in the mind and can thus be controlled with the mind entirely independently of one's material conditions. None of which are actually true. A genius is someone who studies a subject in depth and possibly synthesizes new knowledge, and literally anyone can do that, if given the appropriate resources. Anyone can be an artist, all it takes is practice and access to the appropriate resources in some cases, and anyone can be made mentally ill in a stressful enough environment. The Cartesian dualist idea that the mind and body are separate entities with their own separate processes is so prevalent that there's been scientific papers written about how the normalization of Cartesian dualist thinking contributes to mental illness stigma from psychiatry providers, and papers that urge psychiatry providers to move away from Cartesian dualist thinking because of its negative ethical implications and lack of scientific basis. Because of the normalization of Cartesian dualism, even our psychiatry providers, who should understand how brains work, ideally, tend to believe that your mental illness is entirely in your mind and can thus be gaslit, cognitive behavioral therapied, away. This is despite the fact that mind-body dualism is completely false and mental processes are not separate from physiological processes at all in reality. Though the distinction between the body and mind can definitely be useful, neuroscience research even shows that the mind and brain are functionally interdependent with no impenetrable barrier between the two, unlike what Cartesian dualism posits, which is that the mind and body are separate. Like, if I haven't made it clear enough, Cartesian dualism is garbage, because that's not how reality functions at all. I don't think, therefore I don't am, actually. The actual reality of the human brain and mind is a monistic unified whole, rather than dualistic. There is no mind without brain and no brain without mind. And because of this, most neuroscientists are monists rather than dualists. And I'm pretty sure those guys know the mind-body problem more intimately than other disciplines, including psychiatrists. So Cartesian dualism sucks, obviously. But where do we go from there? I'm so glad you asked. Let me introduce you to my bestie, embodied cognition. 1. Embodied cognition. According to embodied cognition, the physical state and capacity of your organism actually shapes the way you think. The body's processes are rooted in their interaction with the world, and the way your physical body perceives the world shapes how you think. And the mind, of course, influences the body in turn, because again, they're not really separate, distinct entities. They are interdependent. The mind is not independent from its host body, and the material reality of existing within your particular meat suit shapes the way you perceive and thus interact with your environment. Embodied cognition is a way better model for understanding the mind-body problem than Cartesian dualism. According to Dr. Margaret Wilson's 2002 paper, 6 Views of Embodied Cognition, the 6 views of embodied cognition are: 1. Cognition is situated. Cognitive activity takes place in the context of a real-world environment, and it inherently involves perception and action. This view posits that cognition is not a separate process from your environment. It takes place in context. Your brain isn't in some black box isolated from everything around it. You're constantly scanning and processing your environment and figuring out what to do next. 2. Cognition is time pressured. We are mind on the hoof, as it says in the paper, and cognition must be understood in terms of how it functions under the pressures of real-time interaction with the environment. The situated cognition that we just talked about that is context-dependent happens in real time based on what is going on around you. 3. We offload cognitive work onto the environment. Because of limits on our information processing abilities, like limits to our attention or our working memory, we exploit the environment to reduce the cognitive workload. We make the environment hold or even manipulate information for us, and we harvest that information only on a need-to-know basis. This would be like calendars or planners or writing an entire manifesto in your notes app when you feel like garbage. 4. The environment is part of the cognitive system. The information flow between mind and world is so dense and continuous that, for scientists studying the nature of cognitive activity, the mind alone is not a meaningful unit of analysis. This is an extension of the previous point and basically posits that your calendar, planner, notes app, etc. is actually all part of your cognitive system, and that attempting to measure any part of your cognitive system independently of those things that are in your environment that you offload your cognition onto is meaningless. Wilson says this view is problematic because while studying distributed cognition, that is, thinking with your mind while using something outside of your mind as part of your cognition, like a calculator, that's important. But it's just one tool in our toolkit of understanding cognition and not the only tool, which is kind of what that claim is saying. I mean, it's basically saying you can't measure cognition without measuring everything else that's involved in that cognition, and that's... I don't know about that. It's kind of funny, though, to think of your laptop and phone and journal and all that as extensions of your brain and part of your cognitive system, though, right? 5. Cognition is for action. The function of the mind is to guide action, and cognitive mechanisms, such as perception and memory, must be understood in terms of their ultimate contribution to situation-appropriate behavior. Basically, the entire point of cognition is to do stuff. And the point of studying cognition is to study how your brain allows you to do stuff. 6. Offline cognition is body-based. Even when decoupled from the environment, the activity of the mind is grounded in mechanisms that evolved for interaction with the environment. That is, mechanisms of sensory processing and motor control. This one is a little bit harder to wrap your mind around, but basically what it's getting at is that you can make counting on your fingers a really small motion, right? Like tiny, barely there, but still mark something in your memory. And this point basically posits that you can do that with other things too, and that you use sensory motor simulations like that to represent or process information. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that later. Wilson claims that 1, 2, 3, and 5 are all at least partially true. 4 is problematic, as we talked about earlier, and that 6 may be one of the most powerful claims despite having the least literature around it. Also in undergrad, I was in Dr. Wilson's visual and embodied cognition lab because I got a 98% on a test in her Intro to Cognitive Science class, but I was in such deep autistic burnout towards the end of undergrad that I never did any of the readings for the lab meetings. And I also missed a few participants, but I guess that's not the worst thing. But Dr. Wilson, Meg, if you ever see this, I'm sorry I was a bad research assistant. I did my best. An example of embodied cognition in action, which aligns with view 6 that we talked about earlier, is that when you see and read the word kick, your brain's motor representation of the kicking motion is activated even if you're not kicking. Kick. When you read and say hammer, the parts of your brain that deal with manipulation of a hammer are also automatically activated. When looking at a picture of ice cream, the parts of your brain that support your ability to taste are activated. I mean, you obviously aren't aware of these processes as they happen, but it's a real thing. Isn't that wild? That's a great example of offline cognition that doesn't really require interaction with the physical world, aside from reading and saying words and looking at images, still being body-based. These seemingly purely mental processes are still rooted in our physical bodies. Your literal physiology and perception of the world through your body shape how your brain and mind functions. If you're born without hearing, for example, your auditory cortex won't function the same way as that of a person who does have hearing, so your perception of the world will necessarily be different than that of a hearing person. And what's even more fun is that if you do have hearing, you're born being able to perceive all the 800 or so phonemes, which are basically the sound building blocks of words, but the particular language you learn as a baby makes you forget how to hear a bunch of those phonemes based on the phonemes that exist within the language you learn. Because your environment teaches your brain that those neuronal connections for perceiving all those phonemes are now superfluous, so your brain prunes them. Brains are so cool, though. And this also means that if you call someone baby brain, you're just saying that they have, like, impeccable phoneme perception abilities. Oh, you're so baby brained. I bet you could learn a language really fast. I bet you can hear all 800 or so phonemes. Unlike me, I'm not a baby. But I digress. What I'm really getting at is that what you learn through your environment literally changes how your brain perceives sounds. Everything you absorb from your environment changes you and your brain, which is a part of the unified whole that is you. This is all thanks to the wonders of neuroplasticity. And what you absorb is rooted in your meat suit's ability to perceive it in the first place. And you can't absorb information without sensory organs, so you kind of need a body to know things, right? Like, how are you going to take in the world without sensory organs? You wouldn't. So now that we know what embodied cognition is, let's go over how to move from thinking dualistically to thinking in a way that aligns with the reality that the mind and brain are interdependent and monistic, and that our consciousness is shaped by our physical meat suit. And I mean, you can still think dualistically if you want. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, even though, like, dualism is wrong and inaccurate, but I'm just trying to give you another tool for your toolkit of ways of viewing the world. A different lens for viewing reality. 2. How to stop thinking dualistically. As I touched on in the intro, I think the normalization of Cartesian dualism as a way of thinking in our society, like the common idea is that mental illness is a problem of your mind that you can think your way out of and unrelated to your material conditions. Or some people are just smarter and more creative than others because they're lucky and that's a natural innate talent unrelated to their material conditions, leads people to thinking in a way that isn't dialectical, and ignoring the fact that reality isn't just a bunch of disconnected and unrelated systems or events. And I think this is a terrible thing and necessarily makes people bad at thinking, and apparently makes psychiatry providers awful, which, like, yeah. Reality is not a bunch of unrelated and disconnected systems and events. Reality is a singular, unified system where everything is related and parts of the system act on each other. It's monist, as we can see in the fact that there's no functional difference between the brain and the mind. And it's dialectical. Like, if I smash two glasses together with as much force as possible, they will break, and they will change their form because of their influence on one another. This is how literally everything in the world works. It's dialectical, you see? The term dialectics comes from the Greek dialego, meaning to discourse or to debate. And the dialectical method is basically a dialogue that aims to uncover the truth by pointing out the contradictions within two opposing viewpoints. According to the philosophical approach to reality called dialectical materialism, the philosophical version of embodied cognition, according to me, contradictions are inherent in all things and all phenomena of nature. Everything changes everything else that it interacts with. Every thesis has an antithesis, and resolving the contradictions between the two leads to a new synthesis, one could say. Dialectical materialism, like embodied cognition, is a monist philosophy that posits that reality is a unified whole with no independent parts that exist outside of reality. But because it's dialectical, the way that unified whole is expressed is in a dualistic fashion, i.e., through the movement of opposites, which makes more sense than everything just being separate and not acting on each other. It's like that meme with the new Garfield toy and the scraggly squished down one. To be loved is to be changed. That is what dialectics is all about. The Garfield is changed by the love given to it, and the one who loves the Garfield is also changed by the Garfield. And that interaction between the Garfield and the Garfield lover is a unified whole that expresses itself dualistically. As a materialist philosophy, dialectical materialism asserts that there is a reality outside of our brains, that the real world and its laws are knowable, even though we don't know everything yet, and that our consciousness arises from that real physical reality. Just like how in embodied cognition, our consciousness arises from our literal physical meat suit. No meat suit, no brain, no consciousness. Contrast this with George Berkeley's metaphysical subjective idealism, for example, which claims that to be is to be perceived, or if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound because no one was around to perceive that sound. According to dialectical materialism and materialism in general, the tree does make a sound, even if it's not perceived, because there is, in fact, a measurable reality that exists independent of our human perception. You don't need humans to be perceiving things for things to happen, especially because we can't perceive literally everything, which means we'll never be able to perceive objective reality, whatever that is, but it doesn't mean those things that we're not perceiving aren't real. As we know, our brain and mind, which are interdependent, as we already established, aren't these objective reality perceiving machines, given that we can't see UV or microwave radiation, or hear the lowest frequencies of whale songs, or even hear all the existing phonemes beyond our infancy. But those things all exist, so our idea of reality is necessarily constructed by what our material physical bodies are capable of perceiving. But if there were no physical reality to perceive, we would not even have a consciousness. No brain without a mind, no mind without a brain, and no brain without a meat suit. And no meat suit without material reality. Reality is real, but every being has a different perception of that real reality, so there's no such thing as objective reality, especially given that light is both a particle and a wave, depending on how you look at it. So our consciousness stems from our material reality, and our brain is an emulator that represents that material reality to the best of its abilities. Like embodied cognition posits, your cognition is literally shaped by your meat suit, which is in line with dialectical materialism. According to Georgian philosopher and political activist who expanded on Marx and Engels' version of dialectical materialism, Josip Jugashvili, the main features of the dialectical method are: 1. Nature is connected and determined. Everything is connected, and things don't just randomly happen for no reason. Things happen because of a reason, and those things can only be understood in the context of their environment, not in isolation. This is just like how embodied cognition posits and neuroscience proves that your brain and mind are not separate entities, they are connected and interdependent. 2. Nature is in a state of continuous motion and change. Think of plants throughout the year. In the fall and winter, plants die off or go dormant for the time being, but then in the spring, the trees and the flowers start to bloom again, and your allergies remind you of that, as all the trees are shooting plant cum everywhere, because male trees are cheaper to plant, so there's male trees everywhere competing for female trees and destroying your sinuses. Awful. I'm not high, I just have allergies. But anyway, nothing is ever static. Everything is always changing, like your brain and body when you do literally anything. Like if you sit hunched over a few too many times, you're gonna get upper back pain. And your brain will concurrently forget what a proper upright posture feels like, and then start cementing the wrong posture as your default. It just creates a feedback loop that it causes you physical pain. 3. Quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes. Quantitative meaning that it can be measured in quantity, like the mass, weight, size, number, etc. of something. Qualitative meaning that it can be measured in quality, like the color, the shape, the smell, the sensation, etc. Think of water. When you're boiling it or freezing it, it changes degree by degree. Small quantitative changes. And then when it gets hot enough to turn into steam and changes phases, going from a liquid to a gas, or freezes and changes phases from a liquid to a solid, that is a large qualitative change. But it is the small quantitative changes that lead up to that large qualitative change. 4. Contradictions are inherent in nature. Everything has internal contradictions. Within everything, there is both a positive and a negative, a past and a future, something old dying, and something new developing. And development requires a struggle of opposites. Making progress relies on resolving internal contradictions and transforming something into its opposite. Like when you first learn something, you start off not knowing it, the opposite of which is knowing. But you want to know it, which is why you're learning it. And there's a contradiction. And at first, the thing you want to learn may be difficult to grasp and understand, but the more you engage with the material, the easier it becomes until you eventually resolve the contradiction of not knowing but wanting to know into its opposite of knowing and understanding the material. This is how a contradiction gets resolved, by being transformed into its opposite. Like embodied cognition, dialectical materialism posits that the real world around us gives rise to and shapes our thoughts and ideas, and the relationship between the real world and our thoughts and ideas is dialectical. It's not a mechanical materialism where we experience the real world and it shapes our thoughts and it ends there. And it's not idealism where our thoughts that we experience independently of the material world or that are based in some ideal that exists outside of reality shape reality. Instead, our material reality shapes our thoughts, and at the same time, our thoughts shape how we interact with material reality. It's one unified process. Just like how in embodied cognition, your literal physical meat suit influences how your brain and mind work, and at the same time, your mind influences what your meat suit is doing, and it's all a co-occurring process. Your environment impacts you just as you impact your environment, and these processes occur simultaneously. None of these are separate from each other. You can't pluck something from its environment without fundamentally changing both the thing and the environment. Everything is always acting on everything else, which means that you are a product of your environment, but also that you can be an agent of change because just by existing, you are influencing a situation you're involved in, the environment you're in, the people you encounter. You're more powerful than you know, and people are even more powerful in groups. I mean, you can really change things for the better if you want. Something to think about. 3. You are a product of your environment. Anyway, all this to say, I am a product of my environment, and you are a product of your environment. But do you know how? Unfortunately, as much as we all like to believe that all our thoughts, all our opinions, all our interests are ours alone and determined solely by us and not our environment, that's actually not true. The mere exposure effect posits that literally just being exposed to things repeatedly makes you like them more. People will grow fond of certain things just because they've been exposed to those things and are familiar with them. You probably like certain things not because they're inherently good, but because you were exposed to them multiple times and your brain was like, yeah, I guess that's pretty nice. I guess other people like this, so I guess I should too. Not me though, I'm built different. I don't like anything. Just kidding, I was actually obsessed with dystopian fiction in high school because I kept being exposed to it since dystopian fiction novels like 1984, Animal Farm, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, The Giver, and so on are kind of canonical middle and high school reading in the US. Also, I hadn't thought about the fact that maybe there's a reason the education system wants us to read stories about how people tried to build a better world and it ended up worse and more repressive than before, and how my mere exposure to such stories made me like them when actually that was completely manufactured by a society that doesn't necessarily want us to try to build a better world. But in a world where what is considered reasonable or good taste is based on what a bunch of white capitalist men decided is good, it's actually quite freeing to know that perhaps what we like isn't necessarily what we would have liked if the world were constructed completely differently, and different values were glorified and normalized. And the white capitalist men part isn't even my opinion, it's just reality, man. The US was founded by a bunch of white capitalist shitheads who built their wealth off of the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of black people, and that legacy is still going strong today. Given that, slavery is illegal except for as punishment for a crime. I mean, the US prison system is just legalized slavery. And other Western liberal democracies have dark histories too. Read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney to learn more. Also, when you grow up in a particular environment, you automatically assume that your environment is normal because it's normal to you, and you haven't experienced anything else to compare it to. We're always swimming in whatever the dominant ideology is, and it's like the air. We can't see it because it's normal for us. And when your environment is abusive, you normalize the abuse around you. Marxist psychiatrist Frantz Fanon discusses this dynamic in Wretched of the Earth. Living in a colonial society like French Algeria, where Fanon worked, is inherently abusive and violent because there needs to be a certain level of violence on the part of the colonizers to maintain their power and oppress the colonized subjects. Colonizers use abuse and violence to maintain the status quo and create mythologies about why the land is actually theirs and why the colonized subjects are inferior and undeserving of their own land, usually regarding the colonized as subhuman and thus treating them as such. This normalization of abuse and violence negatively impacts both the colonized subject and the colonizer. When living in such an inherently violent society, the colonized subject can either internalize that violence and turn it into self hatred, which is what the colonizers want, or attempt to use violence to stop the violence of the colonizer, ideally leading to decolonization. Meanwhile, the colonizers dehumanize the colonized subject so much that oftentimes the colonizers start to dehumanize themselves and everyone else around them too. In the last chapter of Wretched of the Earth, called Colonial War and Mental Disorders, Fanon describes some of the patients he saw as a psychiatrist working in Algeria when it was being colonized by the French, and when Algerians were rightfully fighting back, and like, wow, I think we've honestly grown past the need for a France. I joke. I actually love France, but some of those particular French people in Algeria were pretty whack, bro. One 30-year-old police officer, for example, would spend up to 10 hours per day torturing the Algerians who were rightfully fighting back against the French at the time. The normalization of this violence led him to wanting to resort to using violence in any situation, and actually using violence with his own children, including his 20-month-old baby. He sought Fanon's help after beating his wife, tying her to a chair, and shouting, "I'm going to teach you once and for all who's the boss around here." The last paragraph of this case study is particularly jarring because it shows that while the patient intuitively understood the cause of his fits of madness, i.e., his job as a police inspector, which involved torturing and dehumanizing Algerians, sometimes for up to 10 hours straight, he still didn't want to leave his job and wanted to just be able to torture people without facing any psychological repercussions himself. How do you torture someone who is fighting back against the colonization of their land by your people with total peace of mind? The answer here is that, obviously, you don't. You are a product of your environment, and if your environment requires you to inflict violence on others, you will normalize and recreate that violence in your personal life, no matter how much you try to compartmentalize it. And it's like the Stanford prison experiment, but in real life. Another case study goes over a 19-year-old Algerian National Liberation Army fighter who experienced symptoms of psychosis after the murder of his mother by a French soldier and the kidnapping of his sisters. One day we went to a large estate owned by white settlers with a manager, a notorious colonial, had already killed 2 Algerian civilians. It was night when we arrived at his house, but he wasn't at home. Only his wife was in the house. On seeing us, she begged us not to kill her. "I know you have come for my husband," she said, "but he isn't here." How many times have I told him not to get mixed up in politics? We decided to wait for the husband, but I kept looking at the woman and thinking of my mother. And then she noticed I was looking at her. She threw herself on me, screaming, "Please, don't kill me. I've got children." The next minute, she was dead. I'd killed her with my knife. My commander disarmed me and gave me orders to leave. I was interrogated by the district commander a few days later. I thought I was going to be shot, but I didn't give a damn. And then I began to vomit after eating, and I slept badly. After that, this woman would come every night asking for my blood. And what about my mother's blood? The trauma of having his mother killed by a French soldier and his sisters kidnapped led to him recreating the same violence his family experienced onto someone who was basically innocent, or someone who at least wasn't a target, and then being haunted by the guilt from that violence, leading to hallucinations and even driving him to attempt suicide twice. An environment where violence is normalized and where you and your family are constantly experiencing violence at the hands of your oppressors will inevitably make you violent too, towards others, or yourself. And being an oppressor also means that one day you'll stop being able to compartmentalize the violence and take it out on everyone else around you. There's several other case studies in this book, such as that of a young French woman who developed an anxiety disorder after her senior civil servant father was killed in an ambush because she was relieved that he was gone. and two young Algerian boys that murdered their European playmate, and pre- and postpartum psychoses in refugees, as well as case studies of the results produced by different torture methods Algerians endured at the hands of the French colonizers. And it's all extremely harrowing and a great example of the impact of one's environment on the well being of the self. A violent and dehumanizing environment always yields violence and dehumanization. 4. Cultural hegemony. Using overt violence to control people looks really bad for the most part, though, and it's kind of difficult because it eventually leads to people violently fighting back, as the entirety of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth kind of shows us. Rather than resorting to violent suppression to maintain the dominant ideology, like implementing laws banning free speech, like the US's Sedition Act of 1918, which forbade disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the US government, its flag, or its armed forces, and led to the violent suppression and denial of civil liberties for many socialists and socialist parties, it's easier to convince you that the ideas in your head are your own by putting small breadcrumbs of information with a particular ideology driving them everywhere, than traumatizing you into hating reading and placating you with entertainment that just reinforces the dominant ideology so you won't seek out information that conflicts with it. When people are violently suppressed, people rightfully stop trusting the government as much, but when you suppress yourself and use your freedom of speech, for example, to endorse the dominant ideology while believing that those thoughts are your own, there's less need for violent suppression. You are suppressing yourself in a way that works in favor of the ruling class. This is cultural hegemony, when the working class thinks that the current societal norms and the dominant ideology are just the natural order of things. Cultural hegemony, a term first coined by Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, refers to how the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, maintain rule in capitalist societies through ideological and cultural means. As a Marxist concept, cultural hegemony deals with the capitalist economic base, which encompasses the means and relations of production, basically what stuff there is to perform labor with and who owns that stuff, and the ideological superstructure that arises from the economic base, which entails everything not directly related to production, like culture, art, family, philosophy, media, politics, education, and the like. You get it. The base and superstructure shape and maintain each other in a cyclical process. As we learned earlier with embodied cognition and dialectical materialism, consciousness arises from something that materially exists, like the physical body and brain. And the relationship between consciousness and the brain is interdependent and monistic rather than dualistic. The relationship between the base and superstructure is basically the same, a unified whole expressing itself dialectically. The base, the material economic reality, gives rise to the superstructure, which I guess you could almost see as the collective consciousness and what we as a collective are taught is normal and acceptable through media and culture. According to sociologist Dr. Eric Olin Wright, capitalist cultures tend to affirm two sets of broadly shared values: competitive individualism and privatized consumerism. Competitive individualism refers to the set of values that arises from the fact that under capitalism, companies are always competing to attain the highest market share, be the best in the industry, and earn the highest profits. Some social norms that arise out of this fact are the measurement of one's self-worth through comparison with others, the moral ideal of being independent rather than relying on others, and the stigma around being dependent on others. This is why we have slogans like, greed is good, looking out for number one, nice guys finish last. But even when people reject such simple formulations, a central theme in the culture of capitalism is the desirability of competitive striving for success, even when this is at the expense of others. And this is an example of the capitalist economic base producing a superstructure that values rugged individualism, or competitive individualism as Wright calls it. And though not everyone buys into these values, because a fully individualistic society would be contradictory to humanity itself, given that humans are social beings who frequently need to either collaborate with or build on top of the works of others. Like, you just can't be an individualist to be a human. It doesn't work. However, under capitalism, the social context in which values like community and solidarity are viewed as relevant are constantly being made more narrow. For example, they're fine within families, but become weaker when extended to a larger portion of the population. Oh, you want your entire town to have a good life? Your entire country? The world? Okay, commie. Privatized consumerism is another feature that is valued in capitalist societies. In consumerist cultures, people believe that their life satisfaction depends on ever increasing personal consumption. With privatized consumerism, there's a preoccupation on personal private consumption with little regard for the well being of others. So things like access to housing are viewed as a factor of personal consumption rather than a public good and a human right. Basically, under capitalism, people are conditioned into not wanting to rely on others, viewing their problems as purely individual in nature, and prioritizing themselves over others, even if it's at the expense of others. This capitalist conditioning disrupts solidarity among the working class and leads people to living in constant fear of losing their livelihood and therefore their house and their healthcare and everything connected to that. I mean, if you're in the US where we don't have universal healthcare. The capitalist system outputs competitive individualism, privatized consumerism, and stress. We are all products of our environment, and our environment, assuming you also live in a capitalist nation, has made us really fucked up and really stressed out. A system is what it does. And if a system is outputting the normalization of those values, the normalization of the unscientific garbage that is Cartesian dualism, the prevalence of values that disrupt solidarity and cooperation among people, and overt or even covert but legal violence, then I don't think it's a good one. 5. Conclusion. In conclusion, capitalism is the reason everyone is terrible and I hate most people. Just kidding. Kind of. Not really. For the most part, it's kind of true, because a society built on the idea that it's every man for himself, or that the individual must be prioritized even if it brings great harm to others, can't possibly be a good one. Like, even in like a Kantian ethics type of way, but I'm not going to get into Kant right now. Especially if it outputs like school shooters, the most garbage news media you can imagine, a declining literacy rate, anti-intellectualism, cats! It doesn't output cats though, but it should. That would be way better. Medical and student loan debt, but only in the US, baby! Ongoing endless wars, multiple mass disabling events, exploitation of the working class at home and abroad, and a whole bunch of other garbage. I mean, that's kind of a bleak conclusion, but it's true, and I hope it inspires you to think about a few things. What sorts of values were normalized in your environment? What sorts of values were normalized in your environment? Do you agree with them? Do you think it's correct to recreate those values on a large scale? What media were you exposed to as a child? What sort of media do you consume now? What kind of person has it made you? What have you been conditioned into hating? Why? By whom? For whose benefit? What have you been conditioned into valuing? Why? By whom? For whose benefit? Is it good for you? Is it good for society? What kind of world and society do you even want? And what values do you want normalized on a large scale? I know what my answers are, and the majority involve collective ownership of the means of production, but I want to hear yours. We are all products of our environment and our capitalist conditioning, assuming you also live in a capitalist nation, but the first step to undoing that conditioning is understanding how you've been conditioned, so you can live by a set of values that better aligns with the future you want, so you can work towards building that better future. And maybe if you realize you've been conditioned into hating reading, you'll sit down and read a book for yourself. I mean, I personally don't have all the answers on how to get rid of capitalism, but there's books out there written by people who literally did just that and got rid of capitalism. But I mean, as products of our environment, how would we ever know those answers if we refuse to learn from the people who already figured it out? And we avoid them just because our environment told us to. No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that the knowledge will help set you free. Asada Shakur. Wow, thanks for watching that whole video. That was a long one, and boy, was it an arduous filming process, but hopefully you liked it, and hopefully you learned something cool. And if you liked it, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one. Bye!